Valen stands rigid before General Kane, her mind spinning with the weight of the last few days. The growing unrest in the Irthrulum camps, Zhi'ra's influence, and the strange defiant spark she saw in the Irthrulum leader's eyes. And now, with Kane's watchful gaze on her, the pressure is suffocating. Kane's voice breaks the silence, low and sharp. "You've been in the Irthrulum camps more than usual, Captain." Valen straightens, her tone clipped. "I'm ensuring protocol is maintained, sir, keeping order." Kane leans forward, his eyes narrowing as they lock onto hers. "Yet, I'm hearing about unrest, Irthrulum refusing to work, stirring up defiance, and you, standing in the thick of it." His voice is cold, dripping with suspicion. Valen holds his gaze, her heartbeat quickening. "I'm aware of it, General. Zhi'ra, an Irthrulum leader, is agitating them, but I've got it under control." Kane's lips twitch, a brief ghost of a smile that never reaches his eyes. "Under control, is it? Tell me, Captain, what do you make of this Zhi'ra?" Valen hesitates, just for a fraction of a second, but Kane notices. He always does. His gaze sharpens. "She's different," Valen says cautiously, her words measured. "Smarter than the others, but she's just one Irthrulum. She's not a serious threat. Yet." Kane's fingers began tapping rhythmically on the surface of his desk. Tap, tap, tap. Each tap a calculated beat that fills the silence. Kane leans forward, his gaze piercing Valen's. His voice lowers, but there is no mistaking the conviction in his words. "The dominance of the human race isn't just a matter of superiority, Captain. It's survival. These animals, these alien animals, they're all threats. Always. We control them now or risk our entire existence. And if you..." His words hang in the air, cold and absolute, carrying the weight of his personal belief in humanity's right to rule, and his fear about losing that dominance. "I expect my soldiers to be clear-eyed about the Irthrulum. If you start seeing them as anything more..." Valen's jaw tightens. She gives a short nod, saluting sharply before turning on her heel to leave the office. Her heart pounds as she walks away, but her expression remains impassive as she moves through the cold metallic hallways of the UED compound. Valen can shake the feeling that Kane is still watching her. The walls seem to close in, the weight of the UED's expectations pressing down harder than ever. But in the back of her mind, Zhi'ra's image remains, her defiant stare unbroken. Valen knows she's walking a razor-thin line, and Kane is waiting for her to slip. The winds carried the gentleness back then, sweeping through the Irthrulum village where Zhi'ra grew up. She wandered among her people, watching with wide, bright eyes as they thrived in harmony with the world around them. Laughter filled the air, and the future seemed endless, unspoiled by fear. But this peace did not last. From the sky came the looming shadows of UED ships, descending upon them like predators. The warmth of the day was stolen by the soldiers who marched through the village, shackling Zhi'ra's family and her people in cold chains. Chaos erupts. The Irthrulum are taken by surprise, and Zhi'ra watches in horror as her people are seized, their hands bound in chains. Her parents are among them, their faces etched with pain and fear as they are dragged away by UED soldiers. Zhi'ra, young and terrified, is shoved aside by one of the soldiers as they march through her village, rounding up the Irthrulum. Her gaze shifts from fear to something sharper, harder. Anger flickers in her young eyes. And here she is today. Zhi'ra is much older now, standing in the containment camps. Her eyes burn with the same anger, but is now tempered by resolve. She watches as the UED soldiers continue to oppress her people, but she no longer feels helpless. She is a leader now, her posture straight and strong as she quietly organizes her people. As Zhi'ra moves through the camp, her people look to her with hope, their gazes lingering on her as she passes. But then, a UED loyalist citizen approaches her, sneering. His hatred is palpable as he spits at her feet, his eyes filled with disgust. Without warning, he grabs her by the arm and throws her roughly to the ground. Zhi'ra raises an open palm to onlookers. The time to act is imminent, but it's not now. It was years ago, long before the cracks in Valen's loyalty had begun to show. Back then, she had still tried to believe in the UED's mission, though the evidence of its brutality lay right before her. In a desolate UED compound, far removed from the larger conflicts of the day, the sounds of punishment echoed in the cold air. The crack of a whip tore through the silence, sharp and unforgiving. An Irthrulum prisoner stood bound, his skin marked by lashes, but even as the pain racked his body, his silence carried a defiance that would not be broken. Valen, standing rigid nearby, watched with hands clenched at her sides. This was no stranger to her. This prisoner had once shown her mercy, sparing her life during an ambush when he had every opportunity to take it. In that moment, Valen's breath caught as the whip cracked again. She looked into the prisoner's eyes, and for the briefest of moments, they were not enemies. They were just two people trapped in the violence of a war they had never asked for. The memory of his mercy lingered in her mind, a haunting reminder that the Irthrulum had not always been the monsters the UED made them out to be. Mercy, Captain, not for victory nor for pride, but because even you must feel it, the weight of this war. We are meant to leave the world happier than we found it, not buried beneath its ashes. Those were the prisoner's words to Valen years ago when he spared her life. A soldier carrying out the punishment was mechanical in his cruelty, showing no emotion as he followed his orders. Valen's heart pounded as she took a small step forward, instinct urging her to stop the senseless violence. But the weight of duty held her back. She knew what would happen if she interfered. Her gaze fixed on the prisoner's face. Despite the pain, his expression was calm, unyielding. For a moment the divide between them blurred, and Valen felt the weight of their shared history. No longer captor and captive, but simply two lives affected by war. Her jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain still. Then, her superior's voice snapped through the air. "Captain, stand down," he barked, stepping into her line of sight. "We don't intervene. Let them handle it." Valen's teeth gritted, her body tense with suppressed emotion. She stood there, hands trembling at her sides, as the whip came down again and again. It seemed as though she might act, but then, with a hardening resolve, she stepped back into line. Her face turned cold, indifferent, as she forced herself to watch. The Irthrulum prisoner remained strong, despite the blows, but Valen could no longer bear to look into his eyes. Later that evening, Valen stood alone, away from the eyes of her comrades. Her expression was cold, detached, just as she had taught herself to be. But deep in her eyes, a storm still raged. She had buried the conflict within her for years, but even then, it had threatened to rise to the surface. The years had passed since that day, but the memory of it lingered, haunting her in quiet moments. The seeds of doubt had taken root, but Valen had refused to acknowledge them. Now, as she prepared to face the challenges ahead, that old conflict began to stir once more. Valen turned, her face set in determination. She buried her emotions under layers of discipline, determined to remain loyal to the UED. Valen's face is tight with concentration. She watches Dr. Graves with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Her gaze is sharp, almost predatory. Dr. Evelyn Graves' fingers hover over her keyboard, her eyes narrowing as she examines the latest genetic data. The screen before her displays sequences and patterns, none of which make sense, at least not yet. She's been wrestling with these anomalies for weeks, but nothing fits. Valen stands nearby, arms crossed, impatience creeping into her stance. "What is it, Dr. Graves? What have you found?" Graves barely glances at Valen, her attention focused on the data. "There's something off about their DNA," she says, her tone clinical but threaded with tension. These markers, they shouldn't be there. It's like... She pauses, pulling up older files for comparison, her fingers moving rapidly over the keyboard. Her frustration shows, though she remains composed. Valen steps closer, feeling a knot of anxiety building in her chest. She may not understand the science, but she knows something is wrong. "What are you saying?" Valen presses, her voice tighter now. Graves exhales slowly, her gaze fixed on the data. "I'm saying the Irthrulum aren't what we think they are. These genetic markers, they're not random. There's a connection." Valen's heart skips a beat. A connection to what? Graves' face pales slightly as she pulls another set of data. Her voice drops to a near whisper. "Humans." Valen's breath catches in her throat. "Human." Graves sits back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. "They're human. Or at least they were. Genetically altered, but the markers, they're unmistakable." Valen feels the weight of it all pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. Her defensive instincts kick in. "If the UED finds out we know this," Graves nods, her expression tight, "they'll bury it, destroy the evidence, do whatever it takes to keep this from getting out." Valen stares at the screen, her mind spinning. The Irthrulum aren't just tools. They're the descendants of humanity. How? When? And now what? She takes a step back, the enormity of the truth hitting her like a physical blow. Everything she believed about her mission, her loyalty, the UED, it all feels like it's slipping away. "We've been treating them like animals, but they're human," she mutters, her voice thick with disbelief. "Altered maybe, but we've destroyed an entire group of people, wiped out their culture, their existence. And I took part in this near genocide." She shakes her head, her voice trembling with a mixture of guilt and revulsion. "I've been complicit in the destruction of an evolved branch of humanity." "What have you done? How? How can this ever be undone?" Dr. Graves leans forward again, her tone urgent. "This changes everything." Valen swallows hard, her pulse raising. The truth is out, and there's no going back now. The only question left is, what are they going to do with it?